since you brought up a lot of the different types of illicits and malicious drone uses, Mike Monnik of DroneSec, I'm going to turn to you next. Mike is the founder and CEO of DroneSec, which provides UAS threat intelligence and counter-drone training to military, government, and law enforcement globally. DroneSec collects adversary tactics, techniques, and procedures, conducts technical component analysis, and tracks unique trends and patterns of malicious use of UAS. So Mike, the question I want to pose to you then, so DroneSec does collect and analyze these data on UAS incidents, but it's across such a wide range. You have these active conflicts, terrorist hotspots, criminal misuses, smuggling, sometimes just like the accidental airspace violations. So at this time, could you contextualize how much of this reflects the propensity toward urban targets and their vulnerability? And do you think that'll change? And if so, how and why?
Yeah, great question, Kerry. And look, when you collect data on so many different types of categories and location types and threat actor types, right? Sometimes they can be multiple categories. For example, something can occur in an urban area, but it consists of one type of threat actor, and you can't always attribute it back consistently. So I'll hone in specifically the urban areas. So yes, is the short answer, and yes, we have seen those areas at risk as well. So, just for example, you've seen large agricultural drones dropping things like, chemicals and liquids on people at political protests being held at stadiums. And you've also seen large agricultural drones come down into crowds at events. Sometimes not necessarily there to be a terrorist or a threat actor driven tool, but it goes out of control and it ends up injuring or significantly hurting people. So that comes back to what you said in your presentation as well, right? Proximity wise, they can be bought from any store in that area. They can be launched from anywhere within that area. They can be flown by anyone because there's a very low skill barrier to operating them, right? And I think when we look at critical infrastructure today or stadiums, a lot of the time they're built with hostile vehicle mitigation in mind. So bollards, barriers, gates, CCTV, things that are so ground focused, right? And drones just bypass that so much of that time. And yes, that is, pointing to a vulnerability, but unfortunately, a lot of the time those vulnerabilities are by design. Open roof stadiums need those roofs open for the sky. They're by design and they're quite hard or difficult to protect. So I'll go back to your point of the question of, do we think that will change, and have we seen it being changing? Well, I went and looked at our data set in terms of urban settings, and yes, we're seeing a general increasing trend in the number of drone intrusions to urban areas. And unfortunately, we're seeing an uptick in the types of malicious payloads used. So there was ISR, there was drones intruding in matches and, getting in front of the betting or the gambling side of it, or the broadcast areas as well. But this kind of shifted from, drones looking at other competing teams' training tactics to something like, for example, there was an assassination attempt with a drone with a laden explosive just streets away from a near stadium. So it shows that there's really the proximity problem where a stadium has to keep a lookout for things that could be a lot more than just surveillance, right? And actors are continuing to use these and becoming more brazen, the more successful and non-attributable some of these attacks are by other threat actors. So I just want to use one example because it's quite a cornerstone of some of these stadium types of attacks. You're probably aware, but there was a soccer match between Serbia and Albania, and there was a flag flown, the Albanian flag was flown over the stadium by a drone. And it not only resulted in riots to that stadium and shut down the game, but there was players injured, staff, there was also participants who were injured. And then the riots spilled outside of the stadium, and it set off small riots, burning vehicles and everything in both Serbia and Albania, right? Just from this one kind of critical event. And if you look at how that happened, the pilot actually approached the stadium 2 days before. He had performed reconnaissance. He found a church with a steeple that had visual eyesight into the stadium, and he knew that the signal wouldn't block out as well because he had visual line of sight. He placed the drone there, and 17 hours before the match started, he then positioned himself in that steeple. so he could bypass some of that event security, right? With that vantage point, he was able to execute his mission with that flag. And it just goes to show, threat actors will find that way to exploit it or bypass security, and you need to be ready for that black swan event, right? And so, threat actors are always going to exploit their environment. Sometimes that is also where they're limited by the vulnerabilities, which can be working for the good guys, but that's always going to happen. So on the good side, and what I'll close off with, I guess, is, we have seen an increase in things like, let's find out the data of how many drones are flying, as Chris Church mentioned, in the 1 kilometer radius, the 2 to 3 kilometers radius, and maybe even further, to determine what are the good drones versus the bad ones versus those with intent. We've done some work around this with stolen drones and looking when you have a stolen drone in the area, does that help determine the intent as maybe potentially more malicious? But either way, getting those statistics, whether it's counter US as a service and sensors all over a city, getting those statistics to federal agencies means they can start to move that needle on the regulatory side, right? They have the numbers, they get to tell the powers that be what the problem is. And once the problem is defined, they can start helping prevent that with some of those laws. So, I guess just to summarize it, urban is urban by nature. It's very hard to protect soft targets without it being this, military-esque style of protection everywhere. And so red team exercises, tabletop exercises, just like this group, your findings in a report like that, it can really help with that response, not only the prevention, but the response when something happens. And again, I think the last goal that you want is to make it harder and more attributable, that threat actors feel like it's more and more difficult to do something like this with a drone against these types of targets in urban environments.
Mike, thank you. That was really insightful. Please keep up the good work with your data collection.